Welcome to the International Model United Nations THIMUN training. THIMUN is a conference held at The Hague, Netherlands, and they have a different style of debate that's commonly used in Europe, which is why we adopted it for this conference and this section of the conference. If you're attending the Asia, Oceania, Americas section, you will be using the normal US style structure that is discussed in the very basics and the basics of Model UN training. One of the motions that we're incorporating into the system is a point of inquiry, which is commonly used in the US style. It is also used in other styles around the world. However, we included this one just because this is a place where, in case you have a general question on what time things are happening, or any kind of question, because especially for novice delegates who aren't sure what's going on, you can rise under a point of inquiry and ask a question. For all points, you must wait till the chair acknowledges you and calls on you. And so typically they'll say, are there any points or motions on the floor? And this is where you'll raise your virtual hand and they'll call on you. You can say point of inquiry and then ask your question when you're called on. Point of personal privilege in the virtual environment is probably only used when you cannot hear a delegate. Maybe a delegate's mic is not on. So you can just turn on your mic and say point of personal privilege. The delegate's mic is muted or etc. Typically the chair will catch that. Maybe you cannot hear and so you can try to get a delegate to raise their volume, etc. But again, only use it if necessary. In person, this is often used if the room is too cold or hot and the chairs have the ability to control the temperature in the room, etc. So point of personal privilege is mostly for the comfort and well-being of the delegate. Point of order, in case there's a mistake by the chair in a procedural matter. So let's say, for instance, they were supposed to take questions with the remaining time, then they can rise under a point of order and say, there was supposed to be time for questioning, etc. So anything that the chair may have forgotten or overlooked, you can rise under a point of order and just make sure that it is corrected at the time that that error is acknowledged. So point of order will just acknowledge any kind of procedural matters or procedural errors. A point of information, this will only be used if a delegate, after their allotted time, yields to questions. So whatever time they have remaining, they will allow the committee to ask them questions about the content of their speech or things related to their speech. And so you can ask the question and they will answer. In some cases, in some systems, they allow for follow-ups just for orderly fashions. In most cases in our committees, we'll just allow each delegate to ask one question and then move on to the next person with a question. All right, and also for motions. So motions will be made, and if a motion is made, which I'll talk about what motions there are, it should receive a second. A second we'll just accept by using a virtual hand. If you want to object, you can turn on your mic and object to that if needed. It should only be used if you truly object to the motion. Otherwise, you can just vote to say that you do not want that motion to pass. But if there is an absolute need, for instance, it might run into the lunch or the break time, you can object to that motion. But try not to use an objection unless absolutely necessary. But an objection will be considered by the chair, and if the chair accepts it, the motion will automatically be failed. So motion for an unmoderated caucus, or also known as an informal caucus. So this is the one where you meet in your small groups, typically with those who have a similar policy than you, but it can also be used as a time to kind of lobby for your resolutions and or amendments. We will be using breakout rooms. So make sure that you have your Zooms updated so that you can choose your breakout room. In case you don't like the breakout room that you're in, you can easily move from room to room. Typically, we ask that you choose a room early on, figure out which room you want to go into. That way, by the midway through the committee, you're solidified in a particular breakout room. And the motion for an unmoderated caucus should have a certain time length and a purpose. So typically your chair will smile upon a certain amount of time. A lot of times it starts out at 5 to 10 minutes, sometimes up to 15. Our committee sessions are not very long, so it probably would not exceed 15 minutes. And then the purpose of what you're going to be discussing during that unmoderated caucus. Motion to table a resolution. So let's say you selected a resolution to discuss in committee. You will if you reach a deadlock and cannot make any progress on that resolution, you can motion to table that resolution to move to another resolution to discuss. Once a resolution is tabled, however, it is very difficult to go back to that particular resolution. So before you do that, you probably do not want to withdraw it right away. The submitters will submit the motion to table the resolution. There'll typically be a speech, 2 speakers for, 2 speakers against, and then a majority of the committee will need to vote in favor of tabling that particular resolution. Motion to reconsider a resolution is at the end of debate typically. If you have discussed a resolution and even voted on that resolution, you can reconsider that resolution by redebating on it or revoting on it. And typically, again, it is when no other resolutions exist, and that does require a 2/3 majority to reconsider any resolution. A motion to withdraw a resolution means that during debate, before any voting has taken place on that resolution, you can remove a resolution from consideration. Motion to divide the committee. If there's a lot of people who abstain on a particular resolution and a delegation wishes to see and have each delegate vote one by one, you can call for a roll call vote. In a roll call vote, countries will be called alphabetically and can vote yes, no, or abstain. It is at the chair's discretion if they accept this motion, and there are no objections that will be accepted for this motion. If you want to move into voting procedure, it will lead to the closing of debate on the issue. So whatever amendments have already been completed can be discussed or voted on. However, no new amendments or amendments that have not been submitted will no longer be able to be discussed. So it will automatically call for our voting on the amendments and the resolution. And it will require a second, and objections are also okay. So a country can object to it. The chair will have discretion as well. All right, in terms of yields, after you complete your speaking time, you will be allotted a certain amount of time on the floor. After you complete that, you can do one of 3 things. First, if you want, you can yield to another delegate. You should only yield to another delegate if that delegate knows that you're planning on yielding to them. If a delegate yields to you and you do not want the time, you can always decline the time and just yield your time to the chair that you've been yielded. However, typically it is for another speaker to continue on the discussion of what the previous speaker was doing, or you can talk about a completely different topic, but to use whatever time is left to your discretion. You can also yield to point of information. This means if you want the committee to allow to ask questions to you directly, you can yield to points of information. This means that a delegate will be allowed to ask you a question about the content of your speech or your policies with the remaining time that you have. And you could yield to the chair. So if you do not want to yield to another delegate or you do not want to yield to questions, you can forfeit your remaining time and give it to the chair, and committee will resume as normal. All right, there are 2 different types of amendments that can be passed. Typically amendments, the first degree amendments are the ones that you are familiar with for those who have attended most conferences. This is just a change to a resolution after it has been submitted. So after a resolution has been submitted, delegates can change what the content of that resolution is. So in the THIMUN format though, there's a different style where when you submit the amendment, there's a certain ordering of the amendments. So first off, if the amendment adds something to the resolution or changes an operative, it does take priority over those that just simply eliminate a clause. So a lot of countries will eliminate a clause because it doesn't agree with their policies, or they don't like the clause itself, or maybe it's controversial. And so those amendments will be prioritized after those that better the resolution. Whenever amendment is submitted, the delegate will acknowledge that they submitted the amendment. The chair will then call on the delegate to discuss the amount, or the committee to discuss the amount of time that will be allowed to discuss that amendment. The amendment will be debated on, then voted on. If passed, it will change the resolution. And if it is failed, the resolution will remain as is and debate will resume on the resolution as a whole. If there are further amendments, then further discussion can happen on amendments that come up, but these are amendments to the first degree. What could happen though is when that amendment is submitted, another delegate may want to make an amendment to an amendment. So an amendment to the second degree is an amendment to an amendment. So ultimately what will happen is discussion will happen with that amendment to the second degree before discussions can continue with amendment to the first degree. Why? Because the amendment to the second degree changes the amendment to the first degree, and you have to discover if that change is going to be made. So you'll discuss the amendment to the second degree, you'll vote upon it. If it fails, the amendment stays as is. If it passes, you now discuss the amendment to the first degree with the amendments that were approved by the committee. In terms of voting, it's very straightforward and simple. So for resolutions or amendments, delegates can vote yes, no, or abstain. And for all procedural matters, which are motions like, do you want to go into unmoderated caucus, for instance, you can only vote yes or no, and you must vote for all of those things. We will be using polling, so it's a very simple process, and you'll actually be able to see the results of the voting immediately. Note passing communication is a really important key of MUN. Typically in person, you will write those notes and hand them around committee. It's actually more efficient this way, where you'll be allowed to communicate directly with delegates using the chat feature. So you can select the country you want to talk to and send them a message. Please be very careful to send it to the correct delegate. If you're trying to send a message to the chairs will usually designate who you should send the message to. So make sure you pay attention to who you should send your notes to when sending it to the dais. Remember, the dais will not be in the same location. So if you send it to one member, they may not respond. And also try to avoid sending messages to all the chairs to sending it the same message to all of them, just to get your message read. However, all messages must be committee specific. That means your discussions in the chat should not be any of personal nature at all, unless we're during a break or a social time where we're trying to communicate with other delegates. Regardless, during committee or during a social time, all messages should be appropriate. At any point, if you receive an inappropriate message or you're the one that's sending the inappropriate message, just make sure you know that if you're the sender, you may be subjected to being removed from committee and losing your credentials. If you receive one, feel free to screenshot it, send it to the chair, and then we'll take appropriate measures. So again, please just don't do any inappropriate messages. But again, there will be some time where you can socialize, and so sending personal messages, as long as they're appropriate, is not an issue during that time period only. Now, to see the overall structure, just for those who are not familiar with this style, one thing is that you should arrive with pre-written operatives or even a full written resolution. Operatives will be easier in our style because we do have a shorter committee session, and so you can assemble them very quickly and assemble a resolution with your group. Okay, then there'll be lobbying process. So lobbying process will be this process where we start to combine these operatives into resolutions. And this may take the entirety of the first session or even longer, but this will create the foundation of what's being discussed in committee. So before any speeches take place, lobbying occurs. Unlike the US format, the THIMUN style discusses one resolution at a time. So after the committee discusses which resolution they wish to discuss, they will allot a particular amount of time to debate that particular resolution, which will include the writing and debating of amendments. So that's the amendment process that I just talked about. And so the discussions will focus on one resolution, and it will continue until that resolution is voted upon or is tabled. And this discussion will be formulated in a similar format to a moderated caucus rather than a traditional speech format that is very familiar to the US system. Moderated caucus will be the debate system within the committee. So throughout the committee, delegates are free to express your country's opinions on the resolution on the floor and may submit any resolutions to change that resolution. This process will take place for each resolution being discussed. Remember, do not discuss or express your personal opinions on it, you are representing a particular country. So make sure you are expressing your country's opinion on the particular resolution. And while discussing the resolutions during informal or unmoderated, aside from informal or unmoderated caucus, you will be using a continuous moderated caucus format, as I discussed before. The final keys for the THIMUN format is one, it's very similar if you know the basics of Model UN. If you're not familiar with that, I would suggest watching the very basics of Model UN or the basics of Model UN videos that are posted on the international website. And one of the most important aspects is coming really ready with solid operatives that can be incorporated into resolution and ready to address any other operatives that other countries may submit. Again, being able to ask questions, being able to critique other people's solutions and ideas is a really important key of THIMUN, and it will create a very efficient debate as we'll jump right into solutions and discussing of resolutions. If you do have any questions at any time, feel free to email us. The email will pop up right after this, or you can come to a session where we do have a Q&A, which will open up in early May. Thank you very much for coming to the International Model UN THIMUN training, and we wish you the best of luck at the conference ahead.